Hello and welcome to this episode of The 12, where we're going to be talking about two of my favorite topics, beer and socialism. And the reason for that is the book for this month is called Socialism Sucks, Two Economists Drink Their Way Through the Unfree World, and it's by Ben Powell and Robert Lawson. I'm interviewing Ben today because I met him back in about 2016 in some godforsaken Eastern European airport, I believe. Is that right, Ben?
It is, and actually we ended up attending a Marxist protest in a square fairly late at night and fairly drunk, if I remember.
Lots of good memories, and you turned your profession of traveling around the world and drinking in socialist countries into a book, which I had to buy, obviously. Obviously, for anyone at home, this is going to be less formal and less of a finance topic than usual, but there is still plenty of serious content here. This book is a weird combination of some inappropriate humor, which we don't usually get from Americans, some real scholarship, some economic ideas, and they're sort of brought into a very real world, first-person experience in beer. It's all about beer in these unfree countries. So, Ben, why did you write about beer?
Well, so the publisher originally called this book the bastard stepchild of Milton Friedman and Anthony Bourdain, because it's kind of the first-hand fun travel account, but with economics and history instead of food. It's an accurate first-hand account of Bob and I's travels, because we both do drink a fair bit of alcohol. And at first, that was kind of in the background, but as we were working the manuscript, it became obvious that the beer actually also serves as a metaphor for how each of these countries function. And what goes on in that market mirrors what happens throughout their economy overall. So then we had a little bit more fun with it and had an excuse to drink a few more along the way.
And you make a big deal out of the fact that you can write off your beer spending from your taxes in America, which is...
Well, this whole thing started like that. Bob wanted to take a trip to Cuba, and my wife wasn't a fan of me just going on vacation with him, and I wanted to write it off my taxes. I'm like, hey, I've got a book idea. But we didn't know if we could write this way because, Bob in particular has written lots of boring articles that nobody reads. And we've both written a lot for like newspaper columns and stuff, Financial Times and other newspapers. But that's like persuasive essay. It's not describing colors and smells and shit while you're in a place. So it was a whole different style writing. So we had to try it out in getting drunk in Cuba and writing it off our taxes and showing it to normal people, not other egghead academics. And after that worked out pretty well. I said, yeah, I think we got something here. And we went with, and we're trying to reach a different audience, people who won't read research articles on socialism, but who will read a beer book and maybe learn about the totalitarian hell that happens every time that people try to implement a socialist system.
Maybe we should mention that you're a very serious scholar at this point, but maybe we shouldn't. We should just continue with the story about beer. One of the things we like to do at the 12 is to have me completely overstate the claim in the book, the central claim in the book, to the author to get their reaction so that people understand what the book's about and also to see what the author thinks of my interpretation. Like one of the early books, I listened to this book on Kindle, so I don't have the notes, the quotes that I would otherwise need, but this is my interpretation of...
My wife, she wouldn't read the book, but she would listen to it on audio, and she said it was really weird because it was someone else's voice, but it's mostly first person I telling the story. Weirded her out.
I think your wife probably did not enjoy the book.
Luckily, she saw the edited version and not the first draft.
Well, the way I saw this book is that we don't actually need something called the Economic Freedom Index, which your co-author pioneered. It's a measure of how socialist and how capitalist a country is. We don't actually need all of that stuff. You just need to taste the local beer and you can tell immediately how socialist the country is. Is that a fair interpretation of what the book's really about?
I would say that the beer freedom index is going to be a lot more high variance than the economic freedom index. So the economic freedom index projects, this is a little bit more dorky here for your audience now, being the academic, right? It started over 30 years ago. And it takes 45 variables and rates things like property rights, size of government, freedom to trade internationally, regulatory environment, inflation, all these things to kind of put countries on a spectrum from most capitalist, which is in most years Hong Kong, although God, that's changing right now. And to the other end of the spectrum, Venezuela is the bottom, but it's not really the bottom because they can't get any data out of North Korea and Cuba. The beer index of freedom would kind of look like that because I can tell you the North Korean shit has gone awful and Venezuela actually kind of ran out of beer. So Meanwhile, Hong Kong is one of the few places in Asia with proper British pubs.
Yeah, you're gaining some fans with your mentions of proper British pubs. I think. I think you have a proper British pub in your basement in Texas.
Yeah, unfortunately, Nick, we're talking while I'm in New Hampshire right now. If this were in Texas, my bottles would be behind me and I'd probably be having a glass.
So let's sum up what the book actually is about in terms of which countries you went to. Getting a bit empirical here, as economists might say. My list is you've got Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, China, Georgia, which is the Eastern European version, not the American state, Sweden, Russia, Ukraine, and you finish with an interesting experience in the USA, or USSA as you put it. So let's start though, instead of digging into Venezuela as you do in the book at the beginning, the phenomenon that I noticed right through the book, which is that you actually found most of the rich data of your observations at the border of the different nations, between capitalist nations and socialist nations. And tell us why that is as well.
Well, that's the case in Venezuela and Korea, not the case in the other ones. The reason's fairly simple. Both our wives said that we couldn't get imprisoned or killed while doing this project. And I'm a professor of economics and run a group called the Free Market Institute. My co-author was running at that time what was called the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom. Like, North Korea is not stupid when they decide which US tourists to give a visa to. We're enemies of that state. So in that case, we spent some time in Seoul in South Korea, went along the DMZ, but then we went up into Dandong, China on the northern border of North Korea and went up and down the Yalu River to observe things, to talk to people who traded illegally across the border with North Koreans and such. And it was really that dictated in that case how we did it. In Venezuela, it's a little bit more interesting in that Cucuta, Colombia, which is on the border, there has traditionally been a place when Venezuela was importing lots of goods with oil revenue and then selling them at below market rates via their price controls. Venezuelans smuggled goods out of Venezuela and into Colombia to make a profit. But that trade is all turned around now because Venezuela is not producing anything. And its oil revenue has collapsed as both prices had come down, but also production had come down. And as a result, Venezuelans with any access to hard currency, or sometimes just their crappy Venezuelan currency, even back when we were there in January of 17, were crossing the border there to buy whatever basic necessities and such they could in Colombia. And it's really striking. Bob and I have both been to around 50 countries each, plus or minus a couple. And I've been in plenty of poor places and seen poverty, but this was different. It wasn't impoverished Venezuelans who were at that border. It was upper middle class ones who actually had some wealth that they could go out and get the goods. The impoverished Venezuelans are the ones actually really losing weight and starving in the country because they don't have access to an external market like that. But we met people who spent 3 days in each direction to go for basic groceries crossing the country. It's not something you see other places. That's where a lot of action was actually on the border.
I think it does. The theme does extend through much more of the book than you suggest. So, for example, the Cuban community in Miami is a good example of the border, I think, between socialism and capitalism. And also in Sweden, which I think we should get to next because it helps define the topic of socialism. There's this issue of people going on ferries across to I think, Denmark, and buying a lot of alcohol duty free and drinking it while on the ferry in order to escape these very high taxes. So the big one, though, was, of course, the issue of lights in Korea, right? With I remember a few years ago, actually, a friend of mine, he saw the same sort of map as I'm sure everyone's seen of Korea, with, you know, the north is completely dark and the south is all lit up in cities, and also China's lit up. But he saw the same map of the United States at night, with some cities lit up and others very dark. And his reaction was, look at all those Democrats with their lights on. But in this case, in Korea, it's much more serious.
Yeah, so I think what you're picking up about the border, Nick, is absolutely right. And it's because we want contrasts to understand when you have two economic systems different that are next to each other, how the outcomes are different. And nowhere is that more stark than North and South Korea. So, you know, go back to the end of the Korean War, the entire peninsula is desolated. Both the North and the South are at a pre-industrial standard of living. If anything, before that Korean War, more of the industry and manufacturing was in the North rather than the South. You've got one country, one people, one history, one language, one starting level of development, two different economic systems. South Korea adopts basically a capitalist economic system eventually. By the early 70s, they're top 20% in economic freedom in the world. So they're a capitalist nation. North Korea, of course, adopts a socialist system. And you get the divergence where today incomes in the South are near $40,000 per capita. Incomes in the North are bullshit because non-market prices in socialist countries are almost meaningless. But to the extent we can estimate these things, somewhere under $2,000 per capita, with people starving when they don't get food aid. But in some sense, you can just see it from outer space, right? The satellite image of the South Korea lit up, North Korea dark. But well, I've seen that image for decades. To show up on the border in the North, we showed up, I think, around 10 o'clock at night, went to our hotel in Dandong and was, I don't know, up on the 20th or so floor. And looking out, it's black across the river. It's lit up like a Christmas tree in Dandong, but just black as you look across. Except there's a city of 300,000 people there. You wake up the next morning and all of a sudden you can see it. I mean, it's the main export city from North Korea to its main trading partner, China, and it's invisible at night. Very striking to see it like that.
I noticed as well that it seems like on the border of socialist countries, to the extent that people are allowed to cross, that's where capitalism takes place, because it's the only place it's allowed to. So people go to the border to try and survive, to try and trade for the things that they need. Whereas the border of some capitalist countries can make you think it's almost totalitarian, especially in the United States, which is a little bit ironic that they've got these tough borders. But let's move on to Sweden. And the only reason to cover Sweden in this video is that it makes you realize that the definition of socialism has been completely reinterpreted, and it doesn't mean what it is originally meant to mean. And that confusion is really important. And you make that very clear at the last chapter of your book when you talk about the USA again. But let's take the example of Sweden for now to make clear what the definition of socialism actually is.
Yeah, so most chapters in Socialism Suck have something about socialism. Sweden's called not socialism. So politicians in the United States, like Bernie Sanders, like to say, oh, when you say you're socialist, what do you mean? He's like, oh, like Denmark, like Sweden, like Norway. And at the same time, our Fox News in the United States on the right wing will call things socialist from there too. And both the left and the right are wrong. It's not socialist. Now, it does have problems. We can get back to that. But socialism meant something to Marx. It meant something to Lenin. It meant something to economists who have studied socialist systems for over 200 years. Socialism means abolishing private property in the major factors of production and replacing it with, I'll say, some form of collective ownership. And in practice, for any large society, that means state ownership and control of the major means of production. And these things are not, 0-1 like you're coding. There's a spectrum of this, of you can be more socialist or less socialist. When I said Hong Kong is the most economically free country, it's still not a pure capitalist environment. There's government interventions there. And at the same time, probably the closest the world has ever seen to pure socialism is either China under Mao during the Great Leap Forward, or Russia under war communism in the early years under Lenin, where you had the two most kind of complete collectivizations. Everything else is on a spectrum in between there. And Sweden, though, there is very little government ownership of the means of production. You go to a hotel, it's a privately owned company. Volvo's a privately owned company. The restaurants and food supply system. The major economic activity is privately owned, and Sweden is actually pretty economically free. Depending on what year you're looking at, out of the 150 countries or so ranked, it's in the top 30, top 25, somewhere right around there. Not that far off of Britain or the United States score. Now, Sweden, what you have is they have very strong protection of private property rights. They have good access to sound money. They have good international trade. They regulate fairly lightly in business and credit markets. Where they screw up is they regulate labor markets a bit, and they have a big government. They have a big welfare state. It taxes, it spends a lot. I think there's lots of problems with a big tax and spend state, but I don't confuse it with socialism. And this comes through in their beer. You've kind of alluded to the border traffic on alcohol. They have plenty of good, delicious beer in Sweden. I had a delicious Belgian beer when I was there that was, not far from Belgium, but it cost more than I had that same beer for in South Korea on the other side of the planet, because they tax the hell out of it, just like they tax the hell out of everything. And, people will avoid the taxes, as you point out, on boat trips out of the country and such. This did have consequences for Sweden. Sweden which was literally dirt poor or snow poor, I guess, in the mid 19th century, they adopted a laissez-faire system. In fact, actually, the guy who put some of this in place was an anti-teetotaler, so I like him for that too. But adopted a laissez-faire system. They grew very rapidly, and they grew eventually by the mid 20th century. At one point, were the fourth wealthiest nation in the world. And then in the 1960s and 70s, they start putting in their big welfare state. And it's not socialism, so it didn't impoverish them, but it slowed their growth. And as a result, they go down to bottom half of OECD countries in wealth. Not because they got poor, it's just everybody else grew faster as we made reforms towards marketization, and they got left behind. So I think reasonable people can disagree about the merits of a Swedish system versus a United States system or a British system, of a trade-off between growth versus the security that some people get from this. But we shouldn't confuse it with socialism, and that's why it's relatively successful.
We've discussed Venezuela a little bit, but the key issue with Venezuela is that they ran out of beer. So it wasn't much of a part of your beer trip. One of the most interesting parts of the book, though, is how they ran out of beer specifically.
Yeah, so well, I can do the beer specifically, but we got to get the bigger picture on Venezuela too, right? Because this one is way down on that socialist end of the spectrum. It's not purely government owned, but it's pervasive government command and control even over what's remaining nominally private. When they put in their Bolivarian socialism, as they referred to it over the 2000s, a lot of people, particularly Hollywood types, talked about this as this is successful democratic socialism. And what you saw in the 2000s, Venezuela sits on the world's largest oil reserves. Your investor audience will know this. And during the 2000s, during the economic boom with high oil prices, Chavez, now the government nationalized the oil industry. Remember, government ownership of the means of production. And it sold the oil on the international market. It used the revenue to input goods and services to Venezuela. If you just looked at GDP statistics and living standard, people looked like they were doing okay. Poverty was going down, literacy was going up, per capita incomes were going up. But this was an illusion with oil. Internally, production was already decreasing in the country. Food imports throughout this time are skyrocketing as food production is going down. Once you hit 2013 or so, when the market starts to come down, and by the way, by then, oil production in Venezuela had gone down, because it turns out the state's not very good at maintaining the oil industry. They have political appointees rather than competent managers. They don't invest in continuing to make upgrades, etc. Then the game was up. They couldn't afford to use the foreign exchange earned from oil to import things, and the shell that was there was revealed. And even when it looked successful, it was underperforming what it should have been doing because of its socialist system. We can do this fancy thing in economics called synthetic control. It basically means you create a weighted average that is basically a fake version. Like we have North and South Korea to compare. We don't have Venezuela socialist and not Venezuela. So the way you do it, you can create a weighted average of similar countries that tracks its performance right up until it gets socialism. Then see the difference between fake and real. Real way underperformed fake even when people were saying it's socialist. How does this relate to the beer? Okay, so what happened in Venezuela with beer is they have a monopoly producer, Polar, which makes a okay-ish beer, and that's kind of boring. It's a basic lager, but it's all right. And government allocates the foreign exchange, and now Venezuela doesn't grow barley. You need barley to make beer. Venezuelan government didn't give the beer producer enough foreign exchange in order to import barley. As a result, no barley, beer production stops.
It's a classic example of central planning making a mess of things.
Yeah. And by the way, it reflects food production generally in Venezuela. There's years during this crisis where the average Venezuelan lost almost 20 pounds. They didn't all of a sudden discover Jenny Craig or some weight loss program. They stopped getting food.
Yeah, there's as much as you make light of a lot of the issues in the book using the beer metaphor, there's some incredibly serious and very depressing aspects to it as well. But on the lighter side, again, it makes me laugh that the same people who were advocating socialism in Venezuela, which was temporarily viable because of oil, are now pointing at oil as the source of all evil with the climate change movement. So they've just moved on from Venezuela just when everything they're talking about has been disproven, in my view. But let's move on to Cuba, because Cuba started tinkering around the edges of socialism, and I suppose it's moving on that scale of good beer and bad beer, as I put it.
Yeah, well, the beer, it was functioning socialism. They had beer, but there's two types, Bucanero and Cristal. They're both like a skunky Budweiser that's been left out in the sun too long. Although you British like your beer warm, so I don't know. But there's no variety. Socialism doesn't give variety. You just get same, even when they produce, they give sameness. Versus in a capitalist country, you have a great variety of beer. I love when I give this talk, I usually have an excuse to drink a beer at the podium. But usually find some local brew from wherever I'm talking to talk about how their little municipality has a greater variety of beer than all the socialist countries combined. But in Cuba, what you do see is, and it's very exciting actually, Nick, because just in the last few months, things have moved more in this direction. So while you have state ownership of the major means of production, so like you go there, you stay in hotels, they're government owned. You go to restaurants, a lot of them are state owned, they're horrible. But there's alternatives where they've opened up spots for private industry to operate in some of these industries. And lodging is one of them. You can stay in casa particulars, which are people's homes. They don't have property rights in it in the way that we think of property rights of owning it, but they have use rights and exclusion rights to exclude other people from it. But then they got the right to rent out to people for profit. And at first it was only one room, then you could rent the entire flat. And as they've done this, they have the right incentive. They reinvest in the capital, they make it nice because they're trying to attract customers. The state hotels, meanwhile, are god awful. Broken windows, the toilets don't work. There was one morning there wasn't water. We've all been in a hotel where you don't get hot water because everyone's using it. No, there was not running water. Turns out when you pay plumbers and musicians the same, lots of people sing, not too many people deal with shit. So in Cuba also, like the restaurant scene like that, they originally allowed small private restaurants. I think they have to be 12 tables or less. That's up to like 50 now. Originally, they couldn't serve beef or seafood. Now they can serve a variety of things. And there they try, just like the Casas, they invest capital in them, but they deal with the Cuban supply chain. And as a result, after a while, you notice it's the same 12 to 18 or so items that everybody has. It's pretty bland. Cuban food in Miami is delicious. Cuban food in Havana, a Cuban sandwich that's delicious somewhere else is just a shitty ham and cheese in Havana. Now, what's happened there, and this is kind of how it relates to Chinese reforms. In February of this year, they announced a new set of reforms where it completely reverses kind of the structure of permissions. It used to be that there was, they call it self-employment, but it really is more than self-employment. It allows you small-scale private employment. There was about 100 different things that you could do legally as self-employment. Now it's reversed, that you can do it in all industries except for about 100 that there is, a little over 100 that they're reserving exclusively for the state. This was just announced in February. And of course, what's on paper might be different than what's allowed in practice too. But it'll be interesting to see. There's no push for like privatization of state enterprises the way we saw in Eastern Europe and the Soviet bloc. But much like China, this is kind of like growing a private sector around an existing inefficient state one. And if these reforms last and go, it could be like China's case where what was socialist in 1978 would be a mistake by 1990 at the latest to still call it a predominantly socialist economic system.
Did that speech work on your wife when you were trying to persuade her to let you go back to Cuba again for the second edition?
I am not looking to go back to Cuba for the second edition. That sucks. Basically, from 8 a.m. to 12 p.m., I hated life. From 12 p.m. to 12 a.m., I chain smoked cigars and drank, and that made things relatively tolerable. And I should say, we laugh and joke about this, but this is from the perspective of, let's call it a rich person from a foreign country visiting a poor place. Usually when you do that, British will be familiar with this, to go into former colonies that are still poor. So you can get good stuff everywhere. In Cuba, it's actually hard to get good stuff. The restaurants still suck and are still blank. Like, the money doesn't really do it for you. I mean, you can stay at the Hotel Nacional, which is where the diplomats stay. By all accounts, that's a legit 5-star place. But other than that, there's not the same type of thing that is there to service even expats. And of course, now how the average Cuban lives, they're not eating in those private restaurants. That costs $12 to $18 for a dinner. They can't afford to pay that. Their food is much more bland. And I can tell you, even the state restaurants are awful.
One of the really fascinating parts of the book, for me personally, because I hate annoying radio advertising jingles, was that there's no advertising in Cuba. Now, it sounds superficial. It sounds like a silly basic point to make because, if people don't have a profit incentive because they don't own their own business, then they won't advertise. get all that. But the point that you made in the book, which made me sort of sit up and notice a bit, was that you don't know where to buy stuff because there's no advertising.
Yeah, it's a lot of things in a socialist country, in a planned economy. Like I've been to lots of poor countries and things will be different. But in a planned economy, there's things that are different that are not because they're poor, but because they're planned and they're on property. And sometimes it's not obvious to the naked eye right away. And it took a few days before it's like, you know what? There's no signs. And it's often would like walk through the town just looking for things, interacting as we could. And then we want to have a beer and then repeat and continue all day. And it's like you get to the corner and look, is there someplace that serves beer down? You don't know until you're right in front because there's no signs. And it's a simple matter of incentives. If you don't profit by bringing customers in, why make the effort to help them find you? Incentives matter in economics, and socialist systems give poor incentives, not just for the leaders who become totalitarian dictators, but new socialist man, that guy never woke up and showed up for work. We got regular man who incentives matter.
Let's move on to China, which was a strange one because it's not quite Sweden, but it's definitely not North Korea. It seems to me that economically it's become extremely free market, or that's not right. It has become fairly free market, but politically it's still a very tight socialist state or communist state. And you had actually some colleagues at an institute in China visited by some thugs as a result or during your visit, correct?
Yeah, I won't say as a result of my visit, but during our visit. So obviously the Chinese Communist Party still has a monopoly political control over China. But since Deng Xiaoping's reforms that started in 1978, China's moved from what was once a very socialist country to, I would call it a crony capitalist country now, as classifying its economic system. It's got a long way to go. There's still massive state-owned industries, state dominance in the finance and banking sector. But the bulk of economic activity, the bulk of Chinese exports, the bulk of how the economy works, it's markets. Go stay in a hotel there, get drunk, wake up in your room not knowing where you are. You're going to think you're in you could be in a hotel in the United States, in Great Britain, anywhere else. But it's still, and the tension here, usually, right, we see places that are politically free and economically free go together. Socialist and dictatorship go together. China is doing something weird where they're on one of these off diagonals. They've given economic freedom, but not political freedom. Now, that's not impossible, right? Singapore would be another place like that. Hong Kong, for its whole post-World War II existence, it didn't select its leaders, whether under British rule or Chinese, but it was very economically, in their case, until recently, also civilly free. China doesn't give civil freedoms, it doesn't give political freedoms, but it gives economic freedom. And this can create a tension. And I think what we've been seeing out of Beijing the last 10 years or so is increasingly cracking down to, it's really stopped its economic reforms. China's no more economically free now than they were in 2010. It stopped giving greater economic reforms and it's cracked back politically. And we see them exercising that clearly in Hong Kong now. And I fear for Hong Kong's future in terms of its political and civil freedoms, but also its economic ones. And I think, by the way, Great Britain, good on you for giving visas to Hong Kongers who want to come out of there. I wish my government would do the same. I would welcome free enterprise Hong Kong people with open arms.
Yeah, I think people who don't know Ben's work should be made aware that you favor very open immigration, so you don't fit on that left-right spectrum. And some of your most interesting work, apart from the stuff about beer, is on immigration and open borders, which is going to be interesting for people who are fans of Nigel Farage, who's not so big on open borders. Let's just put it that way. But let's move on to China. Actually, let's continue with China, where
let's hold on a second here then. So actually, and you could talk about the story of migration internally in China, by the way, right? Because a huge portion of their economic growth is people going from unfree rural areas to more free enterprise zones on the coast. And a lot of that GDP growth that people like, this is unrealistic, it can't be really 10%. Yeah, they're cooking the numbers somewhat, but a lot of it is you're moving people from places with very low freedom, low productivity to high freedom, high productivity zones, and you get a big boost in incomes. The differences in freedom between internal regions and coastal cities in China are not unlike differences between Latin America and the United States. And we see similar big gains in productivity when we allow freedom to move between countries as what you do between free and unfree regions in China. And you're absolutely right about the free immigration part of this. And Lots of people, when they've read this book and give it good reviews on Socialism Sucks, but the number of number fours or threes on Amazon usually say something like they're a Fox News viewer in the United States. Great book, great anti-socialist. I don't know what that pro-immigration shit at the end was. But that's part of a free enterprise system, is free trade in goods and services, but also free trade in labor. And my next book that came out after this one's called Wretched Refuse, The Political Economy of Immigration and Institutions, which takes seriously the fear that low-income people from, let's say, shithole countries would bring their beliefs and institutions with them and destroy our freedoms. And I don't think there's a good case for it. I think it's a good thing to worry about and think about, but I don't think empirically that that's what happens. Instead, you're more likely to get the Cubans, who are the best anti-socialist voting bloc in the United States, rather than them wanting to recreate Cuban socialism in Florida.
There's lots of parallels as well with
Poke me there, Nick.
There's lots of parallels as well with socialist nations having to lock people in, and that tells you about what's really going on in those places.
Yeah, here's a really good. You said the beer index before. Here's another one for you. If you have to put fences in, if your country puts fences in to keep people out, you're probably doing something right internally and wrong at the border. If you have to put fences to keep people in, you probably suck.
The part that struck me most from my visit to China was when I went into those shopping malls of all of the fake goods. And I'm originally German. And as I was walking through this mall, the sellers would speak to me in fluent English, fluent German, as far as I could tell, fluent Spanish, fluent Russian, fluent everything. And these were, fake goods that were available once you bartered well for a tiny fraction of the price, but a lot of them were decent quality. And these people had learned to speak languages in order to sell better, and they were incredibly good at it. And I think that tells you about the incentives power, because if you go to one of the, I suppose anywhere else in China, you'll struggle to find people who speak English even now. And I really noticed that difference where that it's another example of I suppose that you've got the beer index and then you've got the ability to learn foreign language index. Capitalism just encourages that sort of, and it goes to your immigration point again, it encourages that sort of interrelationship, which is just good for humans, basically. Let's move on to Russia, which you call hungover socialism. It's another one that's on this scale where it's moving towards capitalism.
Yeah, so in China, you had maintained your political communist party, but you de facto moved to capitalism. In Russia and much of the former Soviet bloc, they formally got rid of socialism, privatized industry, but didn't get rid of state monopoly control. So you've got private ownership with pervasive government controls, prohibitions on competition and such. And Russia, Ukraine, they certainly fall into this category. Certainly Belarus. One person I talked to in Kiev who was from Belarus, he joked, he says, "Oh, the Soviet Union didn't collapse, it just shrank to Belarus." And on the spectrum, they're still very economically unfree. They've made progress. And if you're in the capital city, of course, you don't notice this because these are, they're vampire states that they suck the lifeblood out of much of the state for the ruling elite in capitals. So, Moscow, you could be in Berlin, Paris, wherever it feels rich. Kiev, even where, incomes per capita, and they're what, $8,000 per capita, yet Kiev seems prosperous in the city. But it's the extractive nature of the monopolies that come from the urban centers in these places that do that.
Let's move on to more general topics in the specific countries you visited. And the one I really want to raise with you, I think for a long time actually, is the idea that how socialist or capitalist a country is matters less than the direction it's moving in. It's all about the first derivative. So it's all about whether they are becoming more more capitalist or whether they are becoming more socialist. And this came out massively in the last chapter of your book, which was about, I think it's the last chapter, which is about the USA and about whether it's becoming more socialist because socialism got a lot of support from young people, especially in the last few political cycles. So tell us about what you think of my idea that it's about the direction of change rather than the position. And then I guess you can tell us about what ended up happening in the US with the popularity of Bernie Sanders.
So it depends what we're talking about. If we're talking about living standards, your absolute levels over time matter the most. If we're talking about changes in economic growth or investment returns, changes the first derivative matter make much more. In fact, a good buddy of mine who appears in the book a couple of times, he travels all over the place. He runs a emerging markets fund for Eaton Vance. And his whole fund is basically based around the idea of invest in countries that are improving in economic freedom. So bet on policy reform because you get abnormally high investment returns there. You don't get high returns by investing in a free country. That's already baked into the price of the assets. You get high returns in the country that's going to change. Showing up in East Berlin in 1989 with the suitcase full of money, you're going to have abnormal returns coming out of that. And the whole thing is based on that. So in that sense, I think you're absolutely right. And it's also, in terms of growth rates, you could think about, a normal, wealthy country that has good institutions. When there's profit opportunities, they don't last. Entrepreneurs seize them. And the joke in economics is called big bills on the sidewalks. There's no $100 bills on the sidewalks. If there were, they'd be quickly grasped. But when you get a repressed economy, the underlying technology, preferences, resources, costs, everything's changed. But entrepreneurs have been repressed and not seized those opportunities. All of a sudden, you get more economic freedom. There's like a flurry of activity of picking up bills, and that generates the higher growth rates. So in that sense, I think you're absolutely right on that. As for the United States, the last chapter of the book that you Brits will like this, it's called Back in the USSA, because we went and we attended the biggest socialist gathering in the United States. And it was mostly, I'll say, younger people, 35 and under, and then some like 70 and older ex-hippies from the 1960s. Not a lot of people my age there. And it was to try to get an idea of what attracts them to socialism. Why do they think socialism is the answer? Whether the United States is moving more in that direction or not, I'm not sure. Certainly its popularity had increased dramatically. And there's something I was trying to understand. I haven't been talking about it as much recently, but when we started this project in 2016, Bernie Sanders had just a very populist run for president with lots of youth support. And it was, one presidential cycle back, and the one before that, it was Youth for Ron Paul. How did Youth for Ron Paul become Youth for Bernie Sanders? They're both kind of anti-establishment, but one's big on capitalism and one is socialist, and trying to understand this change of dynamic.
Yeah, it's the big disappointment, Ron Paul not making it in the end, and I'm sure lots of people are disappointed that Bernie Sanders didn't make it. As much as a relief as it is for us, I suppose. Let's move on to, I think, Japan, which should be on your list for the updated edition or the second episode, because there's something weird going on in Japan, where I was sitting down with my Japanese in-law family, and I was drinking a beer, and I mentioned beer, and they said, "That's not beer, that's not beer." And I was very confused by this because it looked like beer, it tasted like beer. I can't read Japanese, so I don't know if it is beer or not. But apparently in Japan, this is my understanding anyway, the legal tax definition for beer is incredibly specific, and it's taxed at a very high rate. Whereas anything that's not quite beer is taxed at a far lower rate, which means there's a big industry in Happonshu and a couple of other things. They've got strange names where it's legally not beer, but as far as I'm concerned, it's beer. Now, it's bad quality, but it's still beer. So there's a strange situation where the government's intervened, but the free market's just found a little way around it. I think that should feature in your book. What do you think?
I don't know if Japan will make it into the next one, but what you're identifying does have, in the United States, hard liquor is taxed at a different rate than beer or wine. And where that percentage alcohol is, you find lots of wines, I think it's 14.9% or 13.9. It bumps right up against it and stays below it to be wine. So I think we actually did, this book did really well. We made number 5 overall on Amazon, like 5 overall bestsellers on Amazon. So the publisher was interested in a second edition. What we kind of sketched out is, where are the gaps in this argument? What are the chapters that we don't have that we would like, that we think we could add something? One was going to be worker socialism, and going to the former Yugoslav countries. I think I traveled with you in some of those countries before, and telling the story of Yugoslavia. The other was going to be, I wanted to call it hippie socialism, but the idea of voluntary communes. So spending some time on a kibbutz in Israel, but then also some worker-run co-ops and firms and such to describe that. And then there was going to be a dark socialist, or darkest, I think dark socialism, I forget what we're going to call it. But we were going to go to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia to tell the story of Cambodia under Khmer Rouge. But then the reason we didn't do Laos or Vietnam originally is because the story is really similar to China. It's a communist political party that runs the country that, at least in Vietnam's case, has made significant moves towards capitalism. Japan, I don't know how we'd fit it in there, but I'm willing to hear a pitch from you and drink some drinks with you when I'm there.
I think it's a tax story like Sweden. We didn't get to Georgia, though, which is a big part of the book because it's the libertarian success story.
It is. Georgia is wonderful. So let's end on a high note here. So the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, it's below Russia, just above the Middle East, east of the Black Sea. It's not in a very favorable geographic location. And they made essentially no reforms after the collapse of the Soviet Union until 2004. Mikhail Saakashvili runs for president in the Rose Revolution, gets elected, and he's kind of a Washington consensus, Western-orientated type guy, trained at Columbia. But the real key is he puts Kaha Bendukets, in as his finance minister. And Kaha is a radical Rothbardian libertarian type, and he just wants to privatize the economy. And so he did transparent privatization. We sell the property, goes to the highest bidder, no matter who they are, even if they're Russian, God forbid. And that's transparent. He creates massive unemployment by firing government bureaucrats. Unemployment went up to like 30%. But he was firing unproductive or even negative productive workers. The fun one was he fired the entire traffic police in the country in one day, and the joke is crime went down. And now there's a big anti-corruption campaign. Your police stations that are built in Georgia now are transparent, made of glass to like symbolize this. But in overall picture, they went from like a former Soviet republic that was unranked in economic freedom because you couldn't even get data out of them, to cracking top 10 freest countries in the world. Now, Georgia's still poor, but it's growing rapidly. It's like about $8,000-9,000 per capita, but growing rapidly. And by the way, the alcohol industry, again, shows this well. So Georgian wine, under the Soviet Union, they produced wine in Georgia too, because the central planners were commies, not idiots. They understood that Georgia could grow wine better than, say, Siberia. But what they did is they mass planted, international grapes, Merlot, Cabernet, stuff that we're familiar with, on fertile farmland and produced a bunch of swill. After privatization capitalism they've pulled up all of those grapes. They plant them in the mountains now. They use traditional indigenous Georgian grapes. Georgia claims to be the birthplace of wine, the first place that it happened in the world. And they make a very unique, I can't say the grape names, they're ones we wouldn't be familiar with anyway. But their reds are neat, but then their whites are very interesting because they press them with skins and stems all still in there. So they come out more like a golden color, and they age them or they ferment them in the clay pots underground still in traditional Georgia winemaking. It's delicious stuff, and it's been growing in production. And I don't know about to the UK, but exports to the United States have been increasing almost exponentially each year from Georgia in their wine industry.
It's the ultimate irony that just when we were settling on the beer index of measuring capitalism and socialism, and Georgia goes and does a wine instead, disproving that economists know it all and proving the fact that the free market should just be allowed to do what it does.
France would have screwed that up for us anyway.
Ben Powell, thanks very much for joining us. His book is Socialism Sucks, Two Economists Drink Their Way Through the Unfree World, and his co-author is Robert Lawson. Ben, thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening at home.